When settlers first arrived in Australia, they didn't really recognise that there was a form of agriculture being practiced because it was very dissimilar to that was practiced in Europe. There was no ploughing, there was no overt sowing of seeds, but there was fire stick farming and there was movement of plants around. So the Australian flora and fauna has evolved under a very gentle regime of burning, modest disturbance. And it's also evolved in a very infertile environment, so Australian soils are naturally very low in fertility. In contrast, in Europe, the agriculture has developed on a landscape that's much more rich due to the glaciations that have ground the rock into fertile soils. And in the sort of previous thousands of years, agriculture has developed slowly in terms of ploughing, sowing seed, domestication of animals and plants. And so when the first settlers arrived, their form of farming was totally novel to the Australian fauna and flora. The impact of that was initially quite high. But over the last couple of hundred years, the Australian agricultural systems have become even more technically advanced and more intensive. So there is a much greater impact on the fauna and flora in Australia of modern agriculture. Agriculture is obviously vital to our population. We need the food and fibre that comes off. And the different styles of agriculture produce different quantities per unit area of that food and fibre. So if you look across Australia today, there's a whole range of intensities of agriculture. In the more remote areas, there's still some traditional burning and hunting, and the farming style is really very much as it was, and that's very compatible with high levels of native plant and animal diversity. In the drier country, there's primarily livestock grazing of sheep and cattle. And this uses the natural community, the native grasslands, to provide productivity of meat and wool and so forth. That's quite a low intensity agriculture because although the impacts of grazing can be quite important, the plant and animal community is largely still intact. As we get into the higher rainfall areas, the more intensive uses come into play. So we get cultivation, use of fertilisers, use of crop plants, and so you're getting replacement of the native community. And this is particularly developed where there's water for irrigation, where it's very intensive use of really most of the landscape. And this does displace many, many native species. So the biodiversity impacts of the different styles of agriculture are in an opposite trend to that of the amount of production that comes off it. Native biodiversity can provide services for agriculture. For example, birds control a lot of pests, caterpillars, grasshoppers and so forth. Research has also shown that native vegetation can provide habitat for predatory insects that can in turn move into cropping areas and control insect pests. Remnant vegetation alongside crops also provides pollination services because the honeybees, the feral honeybees that we depend on for pollination of crops such as canola, actually nest in hollow trees in native vegetation. Ecological research at CSIRO and elsewhere has looked quite closely at the requirements of native plant and animal conservation and really worked out more precisely what we need to conserve in farming landscapes to enable both production and conservation of biodiversity. For example, in rangelands, there's a big difference between very heavy grazing and lighter grazing. If you leave good cover and don't graze all the shrubs out, of course habitat is much better for the plants and animals. And if you control noxious weeds and feral animals, of course too you can improve that habitat for biodiversity. In the more intensive areas, the past impacts of clearing have been much greater, and we do need to make much more conscious efforts to return trees, to look after the existing trees that are already persisting in the paddocks. The mature hollow-bearing trees that are scattered throughout the pastures and crops in our rural areas provide habitat and nesting for a whole range of birds. and animals, but they also provide a critical way that animals can move through these very cleared landscapes. They provide stepping stones for resting and refuge for birds, for example. In the last 30 years or so, there's been a considerable change and much greater awareness of the need for biodiversity conservation in agricultural landscapes. But voluntary actions can only take us so far, and research has shown that there is a need to provide financial incentives to help people manage their land in such a way that we don't lose many of our native plants and animals. It's a growing challenge for Australia to continue to provide food and fibre for many, many people and many more people into the future. So the pressure on biodiversity will continue, and so we're going to continue to need science to better understand the problem and find solutions for the meeting of both biodiversity conservation and increased production.